former slaves find themselves suddenly free because they joined the Union Army. And imagine they also brought their families with them. So at Camp Nelson, they had a refugee camp. And this refugee camp, after a couple of bad starts, created the first large black school in Kentucky. First black hospital in Kentucky. Because they needed to take care of those individuals. But I'm going to history part of it, and then I'm going to read you some poems that come out of this. So I want to share how this process works. And I'm in the middle of a new book project based on this same story that tells Kentucky's not very pretty freedom struggle connected to U.S. colored troops. This is Jesse Hobson. This is an example of one of those former freedmen who wanted to be free and join the Union Army. He was living in western Kentucky, and he escaped. His master chased him for a week through the swamps trying to catch him. He ran almost 50 miles to Paducah to join the Union Army. This is an example of these amazing photographs that exist because you could buy one for almost 15 cents. This was probably more than 15 cents back then. But imagine all the books that are now more beautiful because these images are being found in antique shops all over the country, particularly in the parts of the country where there was Union activity. The thing about Kentucky and the Civil War that you may not know is that Kentucky contributed the second largest number of African American men to the war in the whole country. The first was Louisiana, 24,000. Right behind that, I'm going to speed through some of these dates but some of them are really interesting because you talk about Kentucky. The war officially started in Kentucky to join the Army and allow our family members to become free too. It was that thing, that clause, we no longer needed our master's consent, that made us interested in participating. Who their parents were, where they lived, where they signed up. This information had not been available if you do your genealogy. Most people can only go back to 1870 when they do the kind of research. But because of these new archives, you can go all the way to the Civil War and beyond. This information is being digitized. This is an example of the information available in some of the pension records. These are details of, this is the medical history of a gentleman named Randall Evelyn. Documents and affidavits where they were trying to get pensions after the war. My name is Frank X. Walker. This is my great-great-grandmother's signature. Except she was illiterate. This is her signature. I don't know what just happened. That little X in the middle, she was illiterate. They wrote her name on both sides, and they put her mark. For illiterate individuals, you just put an X. And for me, because my name is Frank X. Walker, that was a powerful moment to find this document in the archives and to imagine what that meant. To not be the first X in my family, to actually feel like that she reached across time to tell me that I was also an X. So now when I use my X, it's connected to this story. So now, these young men are vouching for their mother's authenticity. The affidavits were to prove that she was married, that her husband died in the Army, that she had these kids. They had to jump through a lot of hoops just to get $10 a month pension to survive. This is a group of young girls outside the school building at Camp Nelson. This is the larger picture of a whole class of young girls outside the schoolhouse at Camp Nelson. These buildings are torn down. Remember, almost 1,000 of these buildings exist. I'll stop here, because when you go back to Washington, D.C., I'm sure you've been, go to 10th and U Street and see this monument. This is called the Spirit of Freedom, created by Ed Hamilton in Louisville, Kentucky. This is a tribute to all the African-American Civil War soldiers in the United States. The important part about this for me is that the soldiers are on the front, but behind that statue is the image of their families. That's an important part of the story. When you think about, how we think about the Civil War, how we think about our connection to it, I'm going to read you some poems that come out of my research as I'm trying to tell the story. This is the first time I've read this, so I apologize if it's a little rough. And somebody can watch the time for me. I'm a little bit off. I thought we started at 9:30. So, understand how it begins in enslavement. And that's an important story for me because I don't know about you, but when I hear the song, My Old Kentucky Home, I never get the urge to stand like other people. To me, when I think about that song and when it was written, I think about that slave ad you saw before. So I'm going to read a poem that really is what I call a mashup. It takes My Old Kentucky Home, the song, and one of those slave ads, and it puts them in the same space and presents it as a poem. Under the title, Why I Don't Stand. Oh, the sun shines bright on my old Kentucky home. $1,200 to $1,250 for Negroes. 'Tis summer, the dark years are gay. The other sign wishes to purchase a large lot of Negroes. Well, corn cobs, right? For the New Orleans market and the meadows in the bloom. I would pay $1,200 to $1,250 for #1 young men and $850 to $1,000 for #1 young women. While the birds make music all the day. In fact, I would pay more for likely Negroes. Weep no more my life. It's called Silent Partner, in the voice of an enslaved woman. I learned today that Mama, being property, was Master's investment. That taken all together, the only thing more valuable than us was the land. That like the land, I too was property, and also my Mama's interest, same as her increase. I was the reward Master got for investing in my Mama. He liked investing so much. His wife said, my green eyes be interesting, by which I think she mean familiar. I guess she had to sell her to profit, to save face, to compound his interest and multiply my loss. A lot of stuff inside that poem. One of the things about this research is that you can find now digitized versions of wills where individuals who own property, enslaved people, were giving them to their children. I'm going to read you a poem that gives an example of that. Most of this language is taken directly from an actual will from a woman and family in Louisville, Kentucky. This is called After My Decease, a last will and testament. I I give and bequeath all my silverware and plate of every description, also all my beds, bedsteads, bedclothes, and household and kitchen furniture to be split equally amongst my 3 sons and daughter. I give and bequeath to my daughter Nancy my 4-piano, and also my Negro woman Grace, and her youngest daughter Harriet. I also give to my son John all my pictures, and also my Negro boy Alfred, son of the above mentioned Grace. I give to my son James my Negro girl Sally. Slave or slaves, so offended shall be sold, and the proceeds of such sale or sales be appropriated to purchase other servants, to supply the place or places of those sold. In witness thereof I have underset my hand and affixed my seal the 7th day of December, year of our Lord, 1857. Signed, sealed, and acknowledged, Matilda Burks. The part of me as a poet tries to imagine what that mother, whose children were taken and given away, split up. What would she say about this? Well, this next poem is the imagined voice of Grace, and it's called Mother to Mother. She's addressing her mistress, mother to mother. I believe when you go, what use a dead body got with silver and slaves? Well, I thank you for the gift of giving me over to my Harriet. I feel no such kindness for the plowing up of the rest of my children. And the added threat of being sold away for daring to say anything but yes and yes of us, had me dreaming of setting the back of my hand and fixing my own seal. You can shackle my seeds, but you can't shackle my dreams. The above mentioned Grace. And that's part of the challenge, is trying to find a way to take all this history and infuse it with poetry. This next example, if you remember the recruitment poster, the large recruitment poster. If that flash to it. This next poem is called an ABCDarian, and that just means that every line starts with the next letter of the alphabet, from A to Z. And this is in the voice of Frederick Douglass, who was hired to actually write and create the marketing to get African Americans to join the Civil War. Frederick Douglass recruits. Are freedmen less brave than slaves? Colored men, enter the army now. Defend this country in our honor. Enlist and take up arms against our former masters. Fight for your families. Generations of us have suffered under the horrors of slavery. If we wish to be free in this land, we must join in the fight in the battles of liberty. Know that it is now or never. Let us die as free, live as slaves, men of color, brothers and fathers. Let nothing deter you from joining this cause. Our enemies have made this country believe people of color are cowards. Quit feeding those falsehoods. Rise up. Strike down and enlist for 3 years of service. If we march under the banner of the United States, victory will be won. Come, prove we are worthy, exceptional, brave, and yearning to fight zealously for our freedom. One of the it's clear if you look into history, is that it started in 1861. In 1863, it was kind of a toss-up. In fact, the Confederacy could have won the war, and they needed more soldiers. And that was the pressing thing, that need that made Lincoln slowly move away from, okay, you can have slaves if you stay loyal, you can have slaves if you stay loyal. He eventually said, okay, I need those soldiers. I now support slavery. So the idea that he was always for Emancipation Proclamation is not true. It was a gradual idea. In fact, what he believed in was a gradual emancipation. And so here's a poem that's in the shape of a telegram. Telegram from the U.S. to U.S. called troops from the president. And they can't put periods, so they use the word stop in between sentences of these telegrams. So imagine it's being tapped out and sent into the field, all the way to Kentucky. I told General Grant to chew and chop, stop. But you must be the sharpest teeth, stop. You must bite deep and long and hard, stop. You must bite when ordered and often, stop. You must bite like your very freedom depends on it, stop. I must preserve the Union, stop. I cannot win this war without colored troops, stop. I hope they have God on my side, stop. But I must have Kentucky, stop. Then I imagine a telegram from the colored troops in Kentucky back to Lincoln in D.C. that simply says, thanks for finally getting off the fence. Stop. One of the things that is part of this process is studying these images. And there's the idea in poetry called ekphrastic, which means that you look at pieces of art, including photographs, and you let that inspire you to write a poem or tell that story. So here's one connected to this image that you see up there. A slave person who's now a soldier, filled with pride and trying to appreciate what it looks like to stand dressed sharp with a gun in his hand and now know he's fighting for his own freedom. Grove, photos of troops outside the colored soldiers' barracks at Camp Nelson. This was the first time we really look at each other and not be able to tell who mastered the cruelest, who sorrowed the deepest, who rolled in the hardest to hold. We was lined up like trees in the yard, chest out, shoulders back, already hollow stomachs in. Nobody's slaves, nobody's property, just solid oak like men. The only thing taller or straighter than us be the boards holding the barracks at our back. Here, it takes more than pride to stand still, neath these little hats not made for shade. Soldiering ain't easy, but it sure beat the bloody shirt off bondage. I have one for this gentleman, Jesse Hobson, another ekphrastic. It's called Catch Me If You Can. Remember, he ran away. They chased him for a week through the swamps. But also, you've never seen a photograph. You've never had your photo taken. And what it must feel like for somebody tell you just to stand there. And then it wasn't a quick snap. You had to stay still for a minute. If you moved at all, you'd have a ghost-like result. So you've never seen yourself on film either. So you don't even know what your face looks like unless you look in the mirror. And most of these, it's like you didn't have the privilege of a mirror. So this is called Catch Me If You Can. Jesse Hobson, Company F, 108th U.S. Colored Infantry. They say that's me, standing at attention in the picture, imitating a tree, both feet booted, buried to the ground. Looks like my hat and uniform, my same fingers and hands. They say the face looks like me too, but I can't be sure. I was never so lucky as to own a mirror. This is the first and only picture of me I ever seen. I'm standing so still, you can't tell how fast I really am. But I'm a runner. Our whole company was mostly runners. Master Hobson chased me through the swamps for a week. On the whole country, in between West two rivers, but he couldn't catch me. Not even with his hounds. Water ain't nothing for a wet road to a born runner. The voice behind the box said, stand there and hold still. So I let myself stop running so the camera can catch me. But he couldn't know how hard it was for a man like me to stand there like a log, as if old master was looking my way, looking for something in the woods, out of place, something moving, something he think he owned. But it's just the wind. Imagine is, how they felt about the uniforms they wore. And one of the things you can see in this uniform is the shoulder strap that held the cartridge box. And on that shoulder strap is a big brass medallion with an eagle on it. I have another picture of Sergeant Major Charles Singer from Covington, Kentucky. And he's talking about that big brass eagle on his chest. Bird watching. I was an educated man and free from Covington, Kentucky, before I was muscled into the infantry. Many of my fellow soldiers around the fire or on guard duty debating the intricacies of our uniforms, especially the itch of wool, the tight boots, and the placement of eagles everywhere. I have eloquently defended the majesty and the fierceness of the beautiful bald eagle, especially the large one we wear across our shoulder strap. To many an old soldier fresh out of bondage, the proud bird looking for the younger, more skeptical brethren who questioned and challenged everything, said they only loved one bird, the chicken, roasted, and refused to even shine their eagles because they believed that in the heat of battle, it's just a big target in the center of our chest. I considered all that was said, rub my thumb across the set of wings on my breastplate, and wonder which one of us is wrong. One thing that came across was the court transcripts of a mutiny that happened of U.S. colored troops when they saw how one of their fellow soldiers was being treated while he was under arrest. He was being hung by his thumbs and in great pain. And they went to free him, but were charged with mutiny. So this is called simply mutiny. And mind you that in Kentucky, one of the things they did to slow down freedom is that they put, all the generals and people in charge of the army in Kentucky were all former slave owners. So imagine the highest-rated individuals are also slave owners. So they're not exactly committed to the freedom of enslaved people. So mutiny. Mutiny is just a fancy word white officers use when they bark, roll over, or sit up and beg, and we don't. They've been the master their whole lives. They believe obey come natural for colored men. But some of us was already free. Some of us can already spell their own name. And some of us just have a hard time being talked down at like we're dirt under somebody else's boot. Most colored men done mutiny with our eyes and in our hearts so many times since we joined this fight for freedom. It's a wonder our dress blues ain't dark gray. We sleep with death every night, knowing Johnny Rib gonna kill us if they catch us in these colors, whether we lay down our arms or not. Rolling our eyes, sucking our teeth, and not biting our tongues is just fleas on a rabid dog. Not the giant head foaming at the mouth, and certainly not our fangs. One of the things that also was clear is that at Camp Nelson, they had an office where if you could not read or write, you could come into that office and have a letter transcribed and sent home to your family. And that was done almost daily. If you imagine you're trying to communicate, because you might be away from home for 3 years, but you can't make a phone call, and you're not really are used to sending mail. So you go into the office and you say, I want to send to Richmond to my wife, and her name is, and somebody writes that information down for you. For us in Kentucky, it was the U.S. Christian Commission, and they had this special stationery that had their logo at the top, and they would put all the information down and then send it in the mail. But also imagine you talking to a stranger, and you're trying to say the most intimate stuff to your loved one, and some stuff you're just not going to be comfortable saying. And all these individuals, most of them were married, even young, but they missed their family. That's not hard to imagine. So this is called mail call, but M-A-L-E call. I was a fool to believe the money I sent back home to my wife wouldn't up and run off or get lost. I always prayed the words straight after the white lady scribbled across the page in my voice, then signed my name. If I close my eyes when my mail returned and is read out loud for me, I can almost see and hear her, lining her words up like she herself be sitting right across from the fire. I imagine the warmth from the flames is her voice, and the sparks that shoot up is her little laugh. When I open my eyes and stare at the blazing hot embers and pretend she gives me that look till the glow softens and burns out, it's them moments more than anything that make me want to learn to scribble. That and not trusting these white Christian letter writers with the words of every man, that every man wants to whisper to his wife when he missed her as much as I do. So it wasn't, all roses at Camp Nelson. One of the things that happened, they had a new general come in, and he looked around and saw how many families had fallen to soldiers. At the end of November, it was one of the coldest nights of the year. He ordered all of them put out of camp. And at gunpoint, they rounded up all the women and children and marched them at least 6 miles away to Nicholsville. Some of them sick, some of them had to be carried. A lot of them died as a consequence of being exposed to the cold weather. There's a monument at Camp Nelson that pays tribute to those individuals. Another thing that happened a month before that, the soldiers, Camp Nelson, marched south and ended up in Virginia at this place called Saltville. And in Saltville, there's a thing that is referred to as the Saltville Massacre. For about 6 hours, they fought the Confederacy, and they lost, and they were beaten back. And when they retreated, they left all the wounded soldiers there on the ground and came all the way back to Kentucky. The next morning, the Confederate soldiers walked around, and every black soldier they found, they shot them right on the spot. They massacred almost 46 individuals. Some of them, all of them unarmed, mind you, so it's what's called the Saltville Massacre. And this next poem tries to talk about both of those events in the same space. It's called How Salt Works. So I'm talking about the massacre by the Confederacy, and I'm also talking about what happened to the families who died from exposure after being put out of the camp and the protection. When we retreated, we were just following orders, leaving them ashamed and beaten on that cold, hard ground. So many miles away meant abandonment. We were full of loss, leaving them cross the lines, turning our backs on our own with nothing to cover their bodies. It would be hard to survive. We remounted our horses, knowing we rode back without them. At Camp Nelson, we shed many a tear and offered them a monument. We etched their names in stone, but left them no protection. Had we been this cruel before, it felt like deja vu. At the Salt Works, it felt like we just threw them away. And on the page, those two poems come down and meet in the middle and fold back out. You guys know about Paul Laurence Dunbar. You may not have known this, he has a connection to Kentucky. Paul Laurence Dunbar has a very famous poem called The Colored Soldiers. And as a tribute to his father was a Union soldier. But what we don't know, what we don't share, is that Paul Laurence Dunbar's father escaped from slavery in Kentucky. Made it all the way to Canada. When he heard that black soldiers could join up, he came back and joined the Massachusetts 55th. So I have a poem called Golden Shovel for Matilda Dunbar, and it's in the voice of Paul Laurence Dunbar talking to his mother. And it's called a golden shovel because a golden shovel has another poem down the edge of the poem that's a tribute to some other writer. And the tribute is to Paul Dunbar himself. And here are the lines to his poem that says, "We were the mask that grins and lies, and hides our cheeks and shades our eyes." That's his poem, buried in the margin of this poem. In the voice of Paul Dunbar talking to his mother, Matilda. I wish, but I can't say there was ever such thing as a we. I know Papa wore a soldier's uniform longer than he would wear the mantle of husband or father. Who could know which of the horrors, slavery in Kentucky or war, would break him, make him mask himself, refuse the generosity and love you had to offer, that you poured generously onto me? A childhood filled with grins was part of my reward, though marked with his absence and his unkindness towards you. He left me with only the half lies about his exploits during the battle. When he recalled and told it, he tried to disguise all the pain, sorrow, and grief that hides beneath even the most musical of tones. Deep up under our laughter, you always wanted to see joy in my eyes and cheeks, or a book in my hand. You smiled at my fatherless dreams and reminded me to listen to how the music in his story shades and protects and spreads joy to his listeners, always making our sad father, our gallant colored soldier, more heroic in my eyes. That's more interesting on the page. I'm going to skip forward a little bit because I want to save time to take your questions. One of the things about the photos that are coming across in this research material is sometimes the images look a little ghostly because people moved. But if you look at the image, those people who were moving actually looked like ghosts. But I wanted to make sure that in this collection that I don't forget about the children. So this first poem, and there's a companion to it, taken from the Camp Nelson photos, and there's a whole box of those photos from Camp Nelson in the archives at UK's library. This is called What About the Children? Look at all us children, more than I ever seen, villaged in this heavenly place some call a refugee camp. Though I can't rightly say what a refugee is, though I reckon it's like dying and going to heaven without all the dying parts. Newly arrived, our grown-up lives interrupted to go to school, not work, to finally learn how to be real children. Something bondage robbed from us. Dressed up like little women and men, some of us looking like somebody granny, already bruised, sore-footed, scarred for life. We even stand like old people, tired, worn, and full of scorn, spending us whole days trying to squeeze a little light into all the warm places where there should be giggles instead of groans. All right, I'll close with two poems. I can hear y'all grumbling, so overstay my welcome almost. I mentioned, you might have heard my voice quake a little bit when I was talking about seeing these signatures of my ancestors and the power that X. This is me imagining what my great-great-great-grandmother Mary would say about her own signature. Having to sign on these affidavits, she spent 10 years trying to get her pension money. So there are 10 years of records. The page was 90 pages long. The file for her in D.C. was 90 pages long. Affidavits. That's what they made her sign. Mary Eagler. Then make me scratch out an X in ink with two witnesses on affidavits to prove we was man and wife. I fetched affidavits from every doctor still living that examined my husband's bowels and old man's bladder, witnessed his pain and still doubted his suffering while he rocked from the inside out. Then even made me make my mark after David with more witnesses to prove my Randall dead and gone. They made me X the page with witnesses so many times on so many government pension papers that though I could not read or write a lick, I come to recognize my own name when I see it crawling across the page. The fancy M on Mary looked like a woman keep changing her mind. And they even put on Edelyn, a tired old biddy in a bonnet, who done set herself down
quit. Then first think my mark looked like a tired old cross, but after a while, they come to see the long, sharp knife, like my Randall's old scabbard from the war. And then the one connected to her own children's sign, manship. Whose long hand was who, even if I didn't see him. Scratch out their own names, cross with mine on the paper, the square. My X is mine. My William be proud like his daddy. He dressed his letters as pretty as he addressed himself. His ink eased off the quill just as confident and smooth as words off his tongue. But my Scott and his letters seem to take the long way around, make big slow loops, and care not if they back stand up straight or not. My wheel glides across them lines like them pretty hardwood floors, while my Scott, more accustomed to dirt, seemed half afraid to touch. I'm going to stop there. And thank you for your attention. I think we have time for a few questions. If you have any.
That's a question. Right there.
Why did you get into poetry?
Sorry, say it again.
Why did you get into poetry?
What did you say before poetry?
Why did you get into poetry?
Oh, why did I get into poetry? Poetry is one of the languages I speak. I'm also a visual artist and a playwright. Some other images. If I got the other slide back. That's not me. All right, this weekend, I have this up here for two reasons. One is, you know Isaac Murphy, you heard the story, but you may not know that Isaac Murphy's father joined the Union Army, was also at Camp Nelson, and his mother and himself became free, and they moved here to Lexington. That's how showing 8 o'clock both nights at the Lyric. There's also a superhero exhibit of action figures from my collection of action figures and comic books at the Lyric, so you can get 2 for 1 if you make it down there. These are samples of some of my visual art. You said, why did I choose poetry? For me, poetry is quicker. I think most people don't have time to read a whole novel or a book of history, but you could pour through a book of poetry that tells the whole story. So I want people to know this story about Kentucky and our fight for freedom and where it started and how hard it was to get it, and who participated. And I'll probably make some visual art that tries to tell the same story, but I have to write this book. That's the language I'm most comfortable speaking in. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. We have a question back here in the back.
Okay.
Well, you kind of answered a little bit at the end of that.
I won't take that as a slight suggestion. This is not popular. But I do understand your question, and thank you for it. Actually, today I'm focusing on historical poetry, and it's considered a new genre. But only half of my books, I have 13 books of poetry in print. Half of them deal with historical poetry. 3 books on Lewis and Clark in New York, 1 on Megan Evans, Isaac Murphy, but every other book before that deals with family, identity, place, social justice, and being a black man growing up in a space like Kentucky. So I write both kinds of poetry. Because I also love history, and I know that A lot of stories have not been told. Like much of what I said in the beginning, it put some of you to sleep, but there's a lot of information you never heard before. And even doing the research, I kept being shocked. Like I'm still stunned that Kentucky also joined the Confederacy, right? That they were the 13th state as part of the Confederate States of America. That there was a capital of the Confederate States of America in Bowling Green, Kentucky. That was never in my history book. And I think that's important. And there are more things I didn't have time to tell you about. But the big story for me is if you ever go south or if you go as a group, to see Camp Nelson different than it is. It's not just a monument, it's not just a cemetery. There's so much history there that's connected to many of us. Because those 9,000 troops moved away from those places where they enslaved, and many of them came to Lexington. Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you. For me, I think I'm an old school poet. I think you should read like you mean it. I don't consider myself a slam poet or a performance poet, but I want the poetry to live on the page, for you to enjoy it as well. Here are two examples of, these are 3-story tall poems that are 30 minutes. You may have seen them driving by. Next time you go by, stop and read these poems. Some of you may live in the East End. That's where I live. But these poems, this first one on the right is Ode to the East End. I mean, it's a modern poem. And it's about, smelling the peanuts burning at the peanut factory. And, living next to a motorcycle club. And hearing the sirens go through our part of the community all the time. And the rough reputation the East End has. But it also is about, why you might love that part of town if you have a connection to it. For me, I think if you put the words together in the right way, that anybody can read it and get a level of performance to it. I'm glad you recognize that they can be performed, but I don't think of myself as needing to be there for you to hear them or to enjoy them. It's most important that whoever you are, that when you open the page and you read it, that it speaks to you, that you understand what's happening visually, and what it might do beyond that, especially the emotional stuff. Because for me, every poem has an emotional temperature. Some of these poems hurt to write. The ones about enslavement and about families being sold and torn apart, that hurts to write about. But I think it's also part of the truth. And I think part of the story is appreciating, understanding, and embracing what the truth is, and growing from that. This young man on the left here. How old was I when I wrote my first poem? What inspired me? I started writing poetry in middle school, but it wasn't any good. Right? I'll share this slightly embarrassing anecdote. It was February 13th. The next day was Valentine's Day. I got on the Super X and bought a blank card, and I wrote a poem in it, and I bought a giant candy bar. And the next day in the library, I walked up to Delphine Bartleston, and I handed her a candy bar and this card with a poem in it that I had written, I felt good about. Delphine was in 8th grade, I was in 7th grade. So I was bold, but I was also blind because Delphine took the candy bar and turned and gave it to her boyfriend. And then she thanked me for the card. So that was my first entree into poetry. And I didn't touch poetry for 3 or 4 years after that. I thought, man, poetry hurts. I don't want to be a poet. And that's a true story. This young man. One more time. This is an important question. Please listen. Go ahead. What can be done to put more about history in our history books? Easy question.
write them. You know, write them. When I was 13 years old, I went to the public library in Danville, Kentucky, and I asked the librarian, why aren't there more books by and about black people? And I was just a kid, and she looked at me, and I remember this, and she said, why don't you write one? I was like, ouch. That hurt, but at the same time, every time I published a book, every time I saw that first book come off the press or out of the box, I always think about that woman. I know she's dead and gone, but I almost want to find her grave and drop a book on the top every time I finish one, because it was motivational. But she also didn't think I could do it, right? So that negative reinforcement is what they call that. Yes, sir.
If you was to choose a different path, where would you be now?
I'd be a history teacher right here at Carter G. Woodson. This gentleman.
How is it you came across your family's connection to the Civil War?
First, I'm the historian in our family, so I've been doing family research for years. When I found out about the pension files of Kentucky soldiers that had been digitized, because I couldn't go to D.C. and sit for hours and look at this information. But now I can sit at my computer at home and flip through. And there's a group called Reckoning Inc. And they put all this information online. It's a free database. Anybody doing research who think you might have an ancestor in the Civil War. And it's very likely if you're from Kentucky that you had an ancestor in the Civil War. And we were able to find a 90-page pension file with those images I shared with you, with the signatures, are from that actual pension file from the 1800s. I'd never seen it before. So that's part of what motivates me to try to finish this project.
Mr. Walker, we have a couple of scholars that have questions, and if they can just come and line up in the front, please, so we can get everyone ready for a question. So if you have a question, can you come to the front?
Looks like the line over here to my right. If you have a question. Yes, sir. Oh, the word that I'm credited for creating is Appalachian. And to me, it's just what it sounds like. It challenges whatever you believe about the region called Appalachia. A lot of people think Appalachia is 100% white, right? But what they don't know is that Appalachia includes Pittsburgh and Birmingham, Alabama, and so much history, and so many historians. You might be appreciative of the fact that Carter G. Woodson, the father of black history, is from Appalachia, which makes him an Appalachian. So look up the word, chase down those people. I can change one thing. I can change one thing. That's a hard one. I'd have been born triplets. Because I can't do everything. And then at least some of me can do other things I want to do. Yeah, there'd be 3 of me instead of 1.
What if you were to change one thing on your path to becoming a poet?
If I could change one thing on my path to become a poet, I would have read more in high school. Right? I was fairly literate coming out, but I came from a school system that didn't treasure or acknowledge other black writers. Like the only black poets I ever heard of by somebody graduating from high school was Langston Hughes and Paul Laurence Dunbar. And I read very little African American history. If I could change one thing,
You know, I had to put those books in my hand, at least in middle school. And by the time I got out of high school, I've been so far ahead. I mean, it took me a decade to catch up because I was so behind on my story and my people's story. And that's what I'm most interested in as a writer, is continuing that story. So that might help me out a little bit. Thank you for both those questions.
What is your favorite poem?
My favorite poem is always one I haven't written yet. Because think about it, if I've already written my favorite one, then I can quit, right? What's the motivation? So it's always the next one is the favorite. You know, right now, these poems I've been working on all year, and I'm not teaching this semester in UK. That's my full-time job. I have a semester off to finish this book. So I try to write a poem every day, and I do the research in the evening. And some of this research is really ugly. But I'm trying to make it palatable. I'm trying to make it a book that people will keep turning the pages and not walk away from. But if I had to choose one, you know, by force, I would probably choose any poem that was written as a tribute to my mother. That would be my favorite. Thank you for your question.
Is there anyone in particular that inspired you to become a poet?
Anyone that inspired me to be a poet. You know, I don't even think of myself as a poet, actually. I say that I'm a multidisciplinary artist who speaks multiple languages, and poetry is one of the languages that I speak. I feel like I'm as much as a visual artist as a poet. I think my teaching is more important than a poet. When I introduce myself to strangers, I don't say, "How you doing?" Because walk, I'm a poet. I say I'm an educator, you know, who also writes, who also paints, who also carves and sculpts. Produces plays, makes visual art. But poetry is just, you know, it's like being multilingual. Thank you.
What is your least favorite poem?
The least poem that I ever wrote? All the ones that never made it out of the journal, I guess. There are a lot of poems that I guess would be my least favorite. That didn't motivate me to finish it. And that's a hard tell. You know, I think everything I read to you this morning, I've never read in public before, ever. You know, some of them I stumbled a little bit, but I was also, maybe you aren't the best audience because it's early in the morning. Part of my process is it needs some feedback from other people. So it's, you know, poetry is about communication. You know, I share this thing, you respond to it, you give me something back. Then I know it's working or not. My least favorite poem right now from this week is a poem I wrote about in the voice of an enslaved woman whose husband had run off and joined the army, and her master beat her because of that, and tried to kill her but didn't kill her. And that night, she ran away and took only the baby. She had 5 kids, she had to leave 4 of them, and she took the baby and left that night and made it all the way to Lexington from somewhere in central Kentucky. That poem hurt to write. It's in the collection, but it's not my favorite. I could have read it today, but I didn't want to share that pain and walk through it again either. But it's an important part of the story, so I have to write them, and I hope people read them, but I can't tell that whole story without including the ugliness that is part of our acquiring our freedom in Kentucky.
Have you ever thought of writing a song about? Sorry. Have you ever thought about making a song about your poems?
I've written some songs before. I've even written opera. There's a basketball opera that's up and running in New York right now called Bounce. You can find it online. It's about basketball. It premiered here in Lexington about 5 years ago. I wrote, I think, 12 songs for the opera. Because I know a little bit about basketball. And they needed a poet who also knew about basketball. So they found me somehow. So yes, is the short answer.
Let's thank Mr. Walker for coming today.
Thank you guys.
Mr. Walker, before you leave, we want to give you a certificate as a token of our appreciation for being here today. Yes, sir.
All right, come on.